you missed it from either the meeting notice or what's up there now, my key message is that the decision to deploy Australian forces in hostilities overseas should require the approval of the Parliament. Is that a radical proposition? In my view, no. The Executive needs the approval of the Parliament for its budget, for legislation, and the same should apply for the decision to send Australians overseas to fight in foreign wars. So how has this come up at the moment? As Desmond has said, the Minister for Defence has referred to the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade this very question: how do we go about decisions to deploy Australian forces in hostilities overseas? That is, how do we go to war? So we have a parliamentary inquiry. Submissions close at the end of this week. As of this morning, the committee has received 29 submissions. About 5 came in yesterday. 27 of the 29, including mine, advocate parliamentary involvement in the decision to go to war. Almost all are from private individuals. Quite a number from former members of the Army or the Navy, none from the Air Force. Some from academics, one from Australians for War Powers Reform. No departments, Defence, Foreign Affairs, Attorney Generals have made submissions. The intelligence community hasn't made submissions. All the 29 submissions are on the committee's website. This talk, of course, draws on my submission, and if you're interested in following up some of the detail, the submission is on the website. I opened my submission to the Joint Committee by asking committee members, and I ask each of you, have you stood at the front of Parliament House and looked across at the War Memorial? Have you stood on the steps of the War Memorial and looked across at Parliament House? It's a bit hard to do that at the moment because they're converting the War Memorial to a museum for war objects, but you used to be able to. So did you ever contemplate the relationship between the two, the role of the Parliament and the decision to go to war? How did Australia decide to go to war in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria? What has been the cost, the financial cost, the human cost? If you look across from the War Memorial to Parliament House, you can see the entrance to Parliament House. You can go into Parliament House. You can visit the chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. You can watch the parliamentarians as they debate legislation. But the executive entrance is hidden at the back of the building. It's fenced off. It has its own security entrance. So it is with decisions to go to war. Oh, there's the picture. So it is with decisions to go to war. These decisions are deeply hidden in the interstices of the executive, fenced off from public scrutiny. My submission to the Parliamentary Committee is a call for change, a call for regulation, not regulation of citizens, regulation of the executive, regulation of the most important decision any government can make, the decision to go to war, a decision inevitably involving life and death, the lives and deaths of members of our defence forces, the lives and deaths of those against whom we wage war, enormous destruction of property, enormous expenditure of public monies. Yet this momentous decision, the commitment of the nation to go to war, is perhaps the least regulated of any government decision. So how does Australia go about the decision to go to war? Simply put, the decision is part of the executive power conferred by Section 61, a power derived from the royal prerogative. I was asked at morning tea this morning how Parliament can legislate when it's part of the Section 61 executive power. I used to be a constitutional lawyer. I'm basically retired now, and I hesitate when I'm not in active practice to express opinions on constitutional matters. But my recollection is that there is clear constitutional authority that Parliament can legislate to regulate what the executive does. So what has been Australian practice? I have up on the screen some of the more recent decisions on Australian going to war and how they were made public. The written paper goes in more detail to these, and in fact goes back to the First World War. But the critical issue is that the decisions are usually announced, sometimes in the media, sometimes in the Parliament. The decisions are announced after they have been made. The executive doesn't go to the Parliament to seek approval. It's always an announcement of what has been made. And there is sometimes limited debate in the Parliament on the formal motion that the House take note of the paper. The debate is fairly limited. The most controversial of the recent decisions to go to war was obviously the decision to invade Iraq. Now, we know from a very thoroughly researched study by an insider, Albert Palazzo, that notwithstanding other pretexts, the Prime Minister's motive was to strengthen the alliance with the United States. The decision was not taken by Cabinet. It was not authorised by the Governor-General. Indeed, the Governor-General, Peter Hollingworth, was not even consulted. I understand that he was concerned that he was not consulted. I understand also from sources that I believe to be reliable that when the archives are eventually thrown open to academic researchers eagerly searching for the Cabinet papers, the policy papers, the departmental analysis of the merits of going to war, the objectives and the outcomes, they won't find anything. This is one of the most disastrous decisions in Australian history. In the United Kingdom, the processes leading up to the decision to invade Iraq have been the subject of a meticulous inquiry, the Chilcot inquiry. It was a very public inquiry and a very public report. In the UK, the processes for going to war have been changed. In contrast, in Australia, while there's been an exhaustive inquiry into the intelligence failures, that's Philip Flood's report, there's been little serious investigation of the processes leading up to Australia's decision to join in that war, or indeed in the processes leading up to the deployment of Australian forces in Vietnam, Afghanistan and Syria. And many see some of those decisions as being based on little more than the whim of a Prime Minister. Many public commentators have used that term. And some see Prime Ministers' subservience to foreign influence as a matter of concern. So what do other countries do? I've listed there some of the practices in some of the other countries. In the United Kingdom, there seems to be emergence of a convention to seek parliamentary approval. That's what Prime Minister Blair did. When Prime Minister Cameron sought parliamentary approval and couldn't obtain it, he accepted that outcome. In fact, the United Kingdom Cabinet Manual now says that a convention has emerged, that such a decision requires, except in emergencies, a prior opportunity for the House of Commons to debate and approve the deployment. That's in the Cabinet Manual. There's some doubt about the strength of that convention after Prime Minister May went into Syria without going to Parliament first. I turn to the legal basis for the deployment of Australian forces overseas. Now, as lawyers, one might reasonably expect to be able to find a clear legal basis for going to war. You'd expect a clear and available paper trail for the decision. Surely, the decision-making chain for such an important decision, the process leading to the decision, should be available and open to public scrutiny. Well, at the time of Federation, the power to go to war remained with the British Crown as part of the royal prerogative. In our Constitution, as I've said, it's part of the executive power, Section 61. In practice, the Governor-General is not involved. As I've said, it's taken by the Prime Minister. Cabinet may or may not be involved. But what are the mechanics? Who directs whom? Where are the decisions recorded? Where is the paper trail? Curiously, there is no clear and direct provision for Australia to go to war. If you ask the men and women in uniform, they will almost always say it's the Governor-General. But it seems the Governor-General is not even consulted. If you ask the military lawyers, and I have spoken to the military lawyers here in the college, and they have another conference and they've sent me their apologies, they point to Section 8 of the Defence Act. And it appears that the government relies on Section 8 of the Defence Act. Now, what's that about? It's in a part of the Defence Act headed Control and Administration. And Section 8 says the Prime Minister has the Minister has general control and administration of the Defence Force. Now, the administrative lawyers here may wish to reflect whether those words constitute a delegation to the Minister for Defence of the executive power to go to war. Alternatively, are those words really directed to relatively mundane matters of internal administration? I understand Section 8 was put in when years ago Sir Arthur Tang reorganised defence and reorganised the relationship between Army, Navy and Air Force. And Section 8 was put in to enable control of that. But the question I ask is, would clear, more specific language be necessary to authorise the exercise of such a momentous power as the power to go to war? Because I wasn't able to find any publicly available documentation of the decision-making process, as far as I could establish, there've never been any documents tabled in the Parliament. I wrote to the Minister for Defence seeking any publicly available documents. I did not receive a reply. I met Dennis Richardson, whom some of you may know as a very distinguished former head of the department. I met him at a social function and talked to him about this. And he advised me to write to Defence Legal. Well, I knew the head of Defence Legal. I did write to him. And the response was that he cannot provide me with legal advice. I did reply that I was not seeking legal advice. I was asking for any publicly available documents. I didn't get an answer. I then made an FOI request for the documents. This was not answered. I didn't even get an acknowledgement. So what inferences can one draw? Can it be that Defence is so concerned that the processes for going to war may be invalid that they are unwilling to disclose those processes? In my submission to the Joint Committee, I encouraged the committee to make the same requests to Defence that I made, to make available to the committee the formal documentation authorising the deployment of Australian forces to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to Syria. So let me come to proposals for reform. There have been a number of bills in the Parliament requiring parliamentary approval of overseas deployments of Australian forces. They've all been put in by the minor parties, the Democrats, the Greens. None of those bills has attracted major party support. There is another opportunity now with this parliamentary committee. So why should we have parliamentary approval? Clearly, debate informs the public understanding of the issues. Defence and foreign policy matters are matters properly central to the functions of government. Just compare the hours the Parliament debates the most minor piece of legislation with the almost complete absence of serious parliamentary consideration of this most fundamental decision. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was a monumental disaster with catastrophic consequences for the Middle East. Yet that invasion was preceded by only the most limited parliamentary consideration. A requirement for parliamentary approval may well trigger parliamentary processes, including, for example, referral to a committee of the Parliament and detailed scrutiny of the reasons for the proposed deployment, the objectives, the costs, human and financial, the readiness of our defence forces, and the lawfulness of the proposal. The democratic process would be enhanced, and our forces deployed into the field would go knowing they had the support of the Parliament. There are, of course, some questions of detail that need to be resolved. What kinds of military activities should require parliamentary approval? Exceptions should undoubtedly be made for humanitarian operations, peacekeeping operations. One of the submissions that came in yesterday from a retired naval officer pointed out that the key issue is deployments overseas, deployments in foreign wars. The issue is not the defence of Australia. So what I'm saying is not directed to defence of Australia if Australia comes under attack.
That's it.
Okay, that's good. There are, of course, quite a number of arguments against, and because these are sometimes put, I think it's worth going into them in a little bit of detail. The obvious one is that the case for war can be based on sensitive intelligence assessments. Is there a risk that the Parliament would vote against deployment because members of Parliament do not have access to the relevant intelligence? Yes, that is a risk, but the risk can be minimised. It can be minimised, for example, by briefing the Leader of the Opposition and selected shadow ministers. For example, the Shadow Minister for Defence, the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Shadow Attorney General. Shadow ministers are often briefed on sensitive matters. It may be appropriate to brief the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security. And remember, the 2003 invasion of Iraq demonstrates the danger of unquestioning reliance on intelligence reports. And I simply observe that no department and no intelligence agency has made a submission that the intelligence issue may be a real issue. Timing is sometimes put forward. Is any requirement for parliamentary approval impractical because of the need to be able to deploy forces in an emergency? Well, in practice, most deployments for war overseas require many, many months of preparation. Only a very small part of the ADF is what they call battle ready at any given time. I understand there's a small group in Townsville which is battle ready, and there is a proposal to have another group The urgent deployments that we see are usually undertaken for natural disasters or for humanitarian relief. I add that the Parliament can be recalled more quickly than the Defence Force can be deployed. Nowadays, the Parliament can even meet virtually. And special provision can, of course, be made for authorisation of deployments in real emergency situations. For example, authorisation by the Governor-General with appropriate advice, perhaps advice from the Prime Minister or the Minister for Defence, perhaps advice from the Chief of the Defence Force that the Defence Force is ready, perhaps advice from the Solicitor General. The proposal would be lawful. So yes, there can be provision to meet emergency situations. What about the role of the Senate? One of the more curious arguments I have heard concern the composition of the Senate, and in particular, the influence of minority parties. Well, the Senate is an intrinsic part of our Parliament. A negative Senate vote can only come about if both the opposition and the minor parties oppose the proposal. So I ask whether those who advance this objection, that because of the composition of the Senate, parliamentary approval is impractical, whether they would also contend that it should no longer be necessary for the Senate to pass our laws, for the Senate to pass our our budget. Alternatively, if contrary to the view I take, the Senate is seen as a serious obstacle, one could think of parliamentary approval being required by the House of Representatives alone, or even by a joint sitting of the Parliament. And there was a joint sitting of the Parliament in the case of the Second World War. The other objection is, these days we have too much regulation. And there's a bit of a fetish about deregulating as much as possible. I simply observe that how war is to be conducted is regulated internationally. We have the Hague Conventions on how war is conducted. And my understanding is that when we do send our forces overseas, they are accompanied by a team of military lawyers who advise on the rules of war, the rules of engagement. We have the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners and civilians. We have the United Nations Charter. So the conduct of war is regulated internationally. In contrast, how we go into war domestically is unregulated. So I come to some conclusions. Is what I'm saying extreme? My answer is no. A number of other countries already require parliamentary approval. I've had the opportunity to discuss this issue with two former chiefs of the Defence Force and a former head of the Army. All three favoured a requirement for parliamentary approval. They're not current office holders. They're probably people of my vintage, so they held those offices some years ago. Similarly, I've discussed this with a former Secretary of Defence, Paul Barrett. Paul was the first president of Australians for War Powers Reform, and his role in advocating war powers reform was mentioned in the eulogy for his memorial service, which I attended a few weeks ago. So both military and civilian leaders involved in defence believe parliamentary approval is the right way to go. So I say the proposal isn't intrinsically radical. The executive introduces the budget. The executive introduces legislation. But these matters require the approval of the Parliament. I haven't heard anyone say the Prime Minister should be able personally to approve the budget or to pass legislation.
I think Scott Morrison said
Why should the process be any different in relation to the decision to go to war? Yes, the initiative, the proposal must come from the executive, but the normal parliamentary processes should follow. So I suggest the question should be turned around. Why shouldn't the decision to go to war require parliamentary approval? Why shouldn't the ordinary processes of our democratic system apply to the decision to go to war? So what, in substance, is the proposal? First, there should be a statement in the Parliament, preferably by the Prime Minister, outlining a proposed deployment, the reasons for it, the objectives, and the legal basis for the use of force. It would then be for the Parliament to determine whether to refer the statement to a committee of the Parliament. That process would enable detailed scrutiny. Parliamentary debate, including parliamentary committees, are integral to the democratic process. Secondly, and this is the key, a legislated requirement for an affirmative vote of both houses, or as a minimum, the House of Representatives, approving the proposed deployment. This would surely be consistent with our modern democracy. I conclude with some words written by Malcolm Fraser in his introduction to a book of essays on how Australia goes to war. It's a call for accountability and change. He wrote, "We must never again allow the circumstances to exist in which one man has the capacity to commit Australia to war." It was clearly directed at Prime Minister Howard and the Iraq War. So thank you for listening, and I would like to acknowledge the assistance I've had from Charlene, who prepared most of these slides, which is beyond my technical skill, and for Tom at the back, who has assisted me with the technology. I appreciate the assistance from the marketing team.
There's plenty of questions. I'm going to take the chair's privilege and start with my own questions. The first more conceptual and the second more political. So the conceptual one is, it seemed like there were two limbs to your paper. The first was about parliamentary sovereignty. And the second, which I think was at least as powerful, was about the lack of any legislative process that would require the government to actually sit down and work through, in a more or less formal way, why we are doing this, what the grounds are, what the costs are, what the argument's about, all of that sort of stuff. In other words, as you say, a kind of detailed paper trail. So my question in relation to that is, are these two separate? Are these severable? Is this really two sides of the same coin, or are they really two separate points? One about documentation and evidence, and one about parliamentary oversight of the process?
Well, I think one follows from the other. I go back, the royal prerogative, power to go to war, goes back to an entirely different society. It goes back preceding our constitution. It goes back to prior to the establishment of parliamentary democracy. Mm-hmm. And the idea that this should be a purely executive decision just seems incongruous to a parliamentary democracy. So if you move to a parliamentary democracy, that means, as I see it, that you set up some processes which are followed. So you then get to establishing a process and a trail of decision-making.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. I've got Joe at the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ernst. And I'm conscious I'm sitting next to a proper international lawyer to my right. But I thought that was a really wonderful presentation, if I may. And I agree with your proposition and with switching the onus to the negative case. But I suppose the question was about the practicalities of defining war as opposed to self-defense, collective self-defense, warlike activities abroad, international deployments. And if you just think historically of how, the United States involvement in Vietnam began with some Green Beret military advisors and trainers. And when did war begin between the United States and Vietnam? Well, who knows? So I just wonder how you would practically, when Australian advisors are committed to Mindanao and then sometimes they're involved in kinetic strike activity and sometimes they're not. And how would you ever draft legislation that could accommodate all of those complexities? Because it's I think, quite easy to say we should never again commit Australia to war in the sense of, deploying the whole national activity to a warlike activity. But I just think the concept of war is too blunt.
It's a good question, and it's quite a difficult one. We no longer declare war. The last declaration of war was in the context of World War II. And whilst you have that famous statement of Menzies that because Great Britain is at war, we're now at war, following that there was a referral from the Crown to the Governor-General of the power to declare war, and there were some Australian declarations of war against Germany and Japan. We don't declare war now, we just send people off. I think there is a distinction, it's not an easy one, there is a distinction between sending advisors, sending troops with firepower. I think the military experts are probably better placed to work through that distinction. But the way I see it is when we send people with powers of engagement, powers to shoot, to bomb, when that's the power they have, that's when this would be enlivened. When we're sending people just to train others, I don't think this would be enlivened. Others with a clearer understanding of how the military works than I have may be able to take that through in more detail. But quite a number of countries have legislation on requiring parliamentary approval to go to war. And I think Australia can find a way through these technical issues.
Yes. Matthew Newhouse recently arrived from The Hague, honorary professor, for those who don't yet know me here. My question is really very similar to Joe's. And can I start by saying very interesting presentation, although I have extreme reservations of having Parliament involved in these processes, partly because of this whole definition of going to war. And I think we need to tease out a little bit more what you're talking about here. I was recently with Australian troops in the Netherlands training Ukrainians in effectively a drone technology for the battlefield. And under your definition, that's fine. We don't need the Parliament involved in that. But we do, and I've been involved before oversighting our engagement in Iraq, which under your definition, you might suggest it has crossed a line, particularly with the work that our SAS and others were doing there. But I would have hated to have had that debated in Parliament, and I think it would have been militarily ineffective. But we also live in a world where if you abide by the UN Charter, which clearly some permanent members do not, you're arguable the sort of definition of war you seem to be coming up with actually could never apply, because either you're acting in self-defense or you are acting under Chapter 7 in such kinetic operations. And I think there's still a big debate to be had over Iraq. So what I'd like to do is just drill down a little bit more to how you would then make this distinction, because by the time you actually would go to Parliament, you would be well engaged anyway, because there just wouldn't be the steps along the way, I would have thought. And by that time, the Cabinet has, at the very least, and certainly the Prime Minister has made decisions, usually, I have to say, through the National Security Committee of Cabinet. I mean, I think we should be fair. I never saw the National Security Committee mentioned, but nearly everything that's been done has gone through the National Security Committee of Cabinet over recent decades.
Thank you, Matthew. I don't know whether the invasion of Iraq went through the National Security Committee. Many commentators have said that it did not. I don't know. In relation to the invasion of Iraq, as you know, there's a range of views. Many took the view that without a decision of the Security Council, that invasion was not legal. There was an Australian opinion signed by officers of Foreign Affairs and Attorney General, which argued that it was legal. That the immediate reaction from a former Solicitor General was rather strong. I think he referred to it as something like Alice in Wonderland. It was a pretty strong reaction from a former Solicitor General. I would answer your question along the lines that I answered the previous question, that I think that when Australians are sent with a power to engage in hostilities, a power to shoot or to bomb, that is when this should apply. If they're training others, I don't think it should apply. But I'm not really expert in how the military is organised. But I think as parliamentarians who've put forward bills, as other countries who've had legislation requiring it, they all seem to think that it is manageable.
Can I just quickly follow that up with, therefore, when you're in a situation like Iraq, where your own, and we had different rules of engagement to the Americans, where your own aircraft are being used for what Joe likes to use the military term kinetic action, you would think that should have come back to Parliament to be debated before we actually deployed our aircraft in that way.
Oh, yes, yes. And as you say, I think we had different rules of engagement. I think it was reported at the time that there were times when Australian aircraft went out on bombing expeditions, and when they saw the target, they turned back without bombing.
Absolutely true.
Because they saw that the civilian casualties were disproportionate to the military objective.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions over here. Lewis, I think you're second. Yeah.
Me first?
Yes, please.
I'm a visitor here. Thank you very much for giving me a question. Tony Kevin, former Australian ambassador to Poland and Cambodia, and now something of a non-person because of my strong public position to the way in which East-West relations have deteriorated over the last few years. I'd just like to reflect on a couple of things you've said very quickly, but I would like you to comment. You referred to intelligence as being a possible constraint on a parliamentary decision. That's my first question, really. We are in this thing called Five Eyes. We have been for many years. Five Eyes has now become not just five eyes, but five fists. If you understand my meaning, we really don't know what sorts of activities by our major allies our servicemen are engaged in. For instance, we don't know if Australians might have been involved in the sinking of the Moskva, if they might have been on secondment to British forces. We don't know if Australians might have been involved in the recent raid on Sevastopol. We don't know if Australians might have been involved in the recent sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, simply because our defence relationships with Britain and America are now so close and so intimate. We do know that Australians were, for over a year, working in Florida in the preparation for the Iraq War, working closely as field officers with American officers. We know that. So that's my first question. And did I have a second question, or is it all tied up in that one? I might just leave it at that.
Thanks, Tony. I reiterate, I'm not an expert on intelligence, although I have had in the past career high-level access to intelligence advice. It once fell to me to provide advice to Prime Minister Fraser on the Sheraton Hotel incident. Some of you might remember that when ISIS, which then was a secret organisation, was conducting an experiment on rescuing somebody from a room in the Sheraton Hotel. They broke down the doors with hammers. They hadn't alerted the hotel. They escaped through a kitchen window. The police caught them fleeing in a car, and they refused to give the police their identity. When I was dictating my advice to the Prime Minister, those instructing me kept saying, "You can't use the word ISIS. No one is supposed to know ISIS existed." And I said, "But it was on the front page of the National Times yesterday." So you'll appreciate that I'm a little bit cynical about ISIS activities. Some of you know that I've given a talk at this college about ISIS bugging the Timor-Leste cabinet officers. A disgraceful episode, probably contrary to ISIS's charter and clearly contrary to the public interest. I recently heard Gareth Evans talking about ISIS, and he mentioned ISIS bugging the phone of the wife of the president of Timor-Leste while he was a minister, and how he had to explain that. So I'm somewhat cynical about intelligence. We know that when the Prime Minister claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, many in the intelligence community disputed that. And one member of the intelligence community actually resigned. So one is a bit cynical, but I would really come back to the view that there are ways of briefing leaders in the parliament. That's a customary process. And my view is that if the leader of the opposition, if the shadow defence minister, the shadow foreign affairs minister, the shadow attorney general say to their parliamentary colleagues, "We have been briefed. Yes, there is an issue. We recommend you vote in favour," I believe that assurance would be accepted. I can't comment, Tony, on the other issues, on whether there's been Australian involvement in some of the current events.
Lewis.
Thank you. I'm Luis. I'm visiting, an academic visiting in my sabbatical ANU. Thank you for this wonderful talk. And I have two questions. One is just a legal question about the arguments. I wonder if you have considered the international law argument, because under the Rome Statutes, aggression is a crime. So the Prime Minister would be liable of committing a war crime if the Prime Minister decides to get involved into a war of aggression. And this takes me to just my second question, that is a political, cultural one. That is, you have been asked before, so how do we understand war? And this is a question that I make from the perspective of pacifism. War is an evil. This is why it is a crime. So I have the Mexican citizenship, the Australian citizenship. And one thing that I like about Mexico is that Mexico has never invaded a country. Whereas here, since I've been in Australia, with my paying as a taxpayer, I have been complicit to military operations in countries far away. I think that there is a cultural difference. The thing is that Mexico, being a country that was invaded and mutilated by the United States in the 19th century, culturally, there is the understanding that the army is an institution in which people are trained to kill people, other people in the name of the state. Whereas here, it is blurry. It is all the army, we express our love through the army bombing places far away. And the thing that makes culturally a huge difference, perhaps by going back to international law and saying, well, there's a reason why this is called aggression. It is evil. We should not be doing this. Then culturally, politically, the change would be easier and would be accepted by the community.
Thank you. I think that's probably more a comment in relation to invasion of Iraq. there was some sort of community tribunal set up some years ago, which purported to, I think, examine whether the Prime Minister of the UK and some others were guilty of the crime of aggression or of war crimes. I don't recall exactly what happened to that. I do recall that during the Iraq War, some military lawyers went to some pains to say that the Australian military were trained in the laws of war, whereas the United States military were not. There was a sharp difference in the training. How effective that was, I'm not in a position to say, but I do think the outlook by Australian forces may be different, although what we now see is what is alleged to have happened in Afghanistan suggests that at least the SAS were not as well trained as they might have been.
Kate, I think you had a question, didn't you?
Yeah, I have two if I can sneak one in, but tell me if that's not okay. The first question I have is just to tease out some of the consequences of your argument for representative democracy. Because from a perspective of participatory democracy, of course, when we, choose to deploy our armed forces overseas in any context, there is public discussion and protest, which is acceptable and healthy in a functioning liberal democracy like Australia. But you said something in your speech about, if we implemented this, troops would go overseas, go off to war, knowing they had support of the parliament. But it's more complicated than that because you've got to have debates in parliament and potentially really sharp divisions and also potentially a very narrow mandate. The whatever it is could, the mandate to go to war could pass very, very narrowly. And what would the effect of that be for our troops? And in particular, I'm thinking about we've heard now about some of the devastating effects that our veterans are living with. So that's my first question. And my second question is, going back to this lovely quote you have, never allow the circumstances in which one man has the capacity to commit a straight war. Would you consider taking your argument even further? If this is one of the most fundamental decisions a country can make, and it affects all people within that country and beyond our borders, should this even be a question to go to a referendum?
On your first question, I think we all know that when those who fought in Vietnam came back, they were not publicly welcomed. And that did have a devastating effect on the mental health of the people concerned. One of the finest speeches made in the Australian Parliament was that by Simon Crean opposing the deployment by Arthur Calwell opposing the deployment. Arthur Calwell was not a great orator, but his speech opposing the deployment to Vietnam was one of the finest speeches that's been made in Australia. Yes, there can be division in the Parliament, but if there is support in the Senate as well as the House of Representatives, that means that the minor parties as well as the government party are voting in favour of the resolution. And that's about as close as you can get in a parliamentary process. Referendums can be very divisive in the community. We're now hearing more and more how divisive and hurtful the same-sex marriage referendum was to the gay community. We're hearing that in the context of the debate about a referendum on the voice. I wouldn't go so far as to say there should be a referendum. I think it's a matter for the Parliament.
Yes. I'm just wondering what you think the chances are of a change along the lines that you're proposing in this current inquiry.
I was amazed when the current Minister for Defence referred this to the Parliament he is generally regarded as on the hawkish side of the current government. He is an enthusiastic supporter of AUKUS when many in his own party are now questioning AUKUS. So why did he refer this to the Parliament? I think it was a Labor Party commitment. I very much doubt whether the government would support it. I have been told that both the chairman and the deputy chairman of the parliamentary committee are opposed to any requirement for parliamentary approval. I don't know either of them. So I'm not in a position to judge, but I think it unlikely.
Yeah, the mixed messages that Richard Miles has been sending is a bit puzzling, isn't it? He set up the inquiry, and on the very day that he set it up, he said he wasn't interested in a change. So it's hard to know what to make of that. I guess you're right. Something to do with it. But it's part of the manifesto, so they're going to do it, and they're not going to pay attention to it. That's democracy. Any last questions? We've only got a couple of minutes. Yeah, James.
Excellent. Thanks, Ernst. Really enjoyed the presentation. Just a quick question about the constitutional issues that arise. You contrasted this position with that of process for passing the budget, and of course there are constitutional provisions that require parliamentary approval of the budget, so the position is slightly different. Were there any submissions made to the inquiry that talked about the constitutional limits of Parliament to regulate the prerogative in relation to going to war?
No, there were two submissions that basically say that you shouldn't curtail the power of the executive. 2 out of 29, 27 support.
That's
Parliament, but nobody.
a policy position being
policy position
rather
yes.
than question of constitutional power.
Nobody, I think, goes into the question of constitutional power. I was hoping you wouldn't correct me on the rather loose proposition I put, but I think there are High Court decisions that say that Parliament can regulate the Section 61 power. I think that's the case.
I see an article coming.
Clear.
If only you weren't head of school, you could write that article. All right. I think we're just on 2 o'clock. Before I close this meeting, I must remember to thank in particular Imogen Saunders and Sippel. It looks like this is a visitors committee seminar. Actually, it's not. Sippel took up the strain on this one and organised it on pretty short notice with the help of Tom and the marketing and comms team. So thank you for all those people for making this really great event happen. And thank you for everybody in the midst of a very busy time of the academic year for coming out in such numbers to hear, to have this discussion. And thanks in particular for Ernst for the wonderful presentation.